The fluorescent lights in the hospital conference room buzz like angry wasps overhead. I sit perfectly still in my chair, hands folded in my lap, watching the transplant coordinator shuffle through my medical files. The antiseptic smell burns my nostrils, but I've grown used to it after months of dialysis appointments. Miss Hartwell, we need to discuss the living donor evaluation process, Dr. Morrison says, his voice gentle but clinical. Have any family members expressed interest in testing? Across the oak table, Richard Hartwell, the man who raised me, shifts in his chair. His face carries that familiar expression of barely concealed irritation, the same look he wore when I asked for help with college applications 14 years ago. Patricia sits beside him, vanilla perfume failing to mask the staleness that seems to follow her everywhere. Michael lounges in the corner, scrolling through his phone like this meeting is just another inconvenience. Well, Richard clears his throat. We've discussed it, and frankly, he pauses, looking directly at the doctor instead of me. Why waste a good organ on a lost cause? She's never accomplished anything anyway. At least if something happens, we won't have to keep worrying about her medical bills. The words hit the sterile air like a physical blow. The transplant coordinator's pen stops moving. Dr. Morrison's eyebrows rise slightly. Even Michael glances up from his phone. I feel something shift inside me. Not rage, not tears, just clarity. I lean forward slightly, meeting Richard's eyes for the first time in months. My voice comes out steady, almost conversational. That's interesting, Dad. Because I was going to tell you that I won't be needing your help anyway. The room goes completely silent. Richard's mouth opens slightly. Patricia's perfectly manicured fingers freeze on her purse strap. Michael's phone slips in his hand. Dr. Morrison clears his throat. Actually, there's something else we need to discuss. The preliminary blood work revealed some inconsistencies. Mr. Hartwell, we'll need to speak privately about the insurance documentation you submitted. Richard's face drains of color. The fluorescent lights continue their angry buzzing overhead, but now the sound feels like a countdown timer. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. They just stare at me like I've become someone they don't recognize. Maybe because I have. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, only to realize they've been stealing from you while you were fighting for your life? What happened next will show you exactly how much damage a family can do when they think you're powerless to stop them. But first, you need to understand how we got here. The favoritism started early, but I didn't have words for it until I was older. While other families celebrated report cards and science fair victories, mine had already decided who deserved their attention. Michael was 3 years younger, born with Richard's easy smile and Patricia's talent for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. I was the serious one, the difficult one, the one who asked too many questions and never seemed satisfied with simple answers. When I turned 18, the difference became impossible to ignore. Michael was still in high school, but they were already planning his future private university, full tuition paid, a car for graduation. When I brought home my acceptance letter to Oregon State with a partial scholarship, Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. "We're not throwing money at a mediocre student," he said, folding the sports section with deliberate precision. "You'll figure it out." I figured it out, all right. While Michael got his $240,000 education handed to him, I took on $127,000 in student loans. I worked as a lab tech during the day, tutored struggling pre-med students in the evenings, and catered weekend events for extra cash. 4 hours of sleep became my normal. My shared studio apartment had broken heating, so I wore my winter coat indoors from November through March. The contrast became even starker after graduation. When Michael finished college barely, with a 2.7 gigapascals in business administration, Richard used his insurance connections to land him a comfortable sales position. When my first biotech startup failed at 26, leaving me sleeping in my Honda Civic for 3 weeks, showering at a 24-hour gym, and living on vending machine food, Patricia told her friends I was going through a phase. At 28, when my second company nearly went bankrupt, I lost 35 pounds from stress and couldn't afford groceries for 2 months. I survived on whatever snacks employees left in break rooms. Meanwhile, Michael got engaged. and Patricia spent months planning his wedding. $85,000 for a reception at the country club, imported flowers, a 12-piece orchestra. When I got briefly engaged that same year, Patricia suggested, "A backyard barbecue should be sufficient for you." The engagement didn't last. Neither did most of my relationships. It's hard to build intimacy when your own family treats you like a burden they're counting down the days to be rid of. The health problems started in my late 20s: chronic fatigue, stomach pains, frequent infections. I'd had similar symptoms as a child, but Patricia always dismissed them as attention-seeking. "Isabella's being dramatic again," she'd tell doctors, rolling her eyes. By 30, the untreated kidney infections had developed into chronic kidney disease. When Michael wanted to buy his first house, Richard and Patricia handed him $150,000 for the down payment without blinking. When I asked for a $20,000 loan to buy essential equipment for my third startup attempt, Richard's response was swift and final: "We can't enable your fantasy ventures." The dialysis started 6 months ago. 3 times a week, 4 hours at a time, watching my blood cycle through machines while I worked on my laptop. The family visited me in the hospital exactly once during my 6-day stay after collapsing from kidney failure. 20 minutes of Patricia checking her watch, and Richard asking when I'd be back on my feet. But here's what they never bothered to ask about, never showed enough interest to discover: my third startup didn't fail. Meridian Biotech Solutions, incorporated quietly under IR Holdings LLC, had grown from my one-bedroom apartment laboratory into a $47.3 million company, 23 patents, 127 employees across 3 facilities, annual revenue of $23.8 million and climbing. The irony was exquisite. Richard and Patricia's retirement portfolio included a Vanguard healthcare fund that held a 2.3% stake in my company through subsidiary investments. Their quarterly statements showed $18,000 in gains from healthcare sector growth. They were literally profiting from my success while calling me a failure to anyone who would listen. Even better, Michael's employer, MedSupply Corp., had been my largest client for 18 months. His commission bonuses, his performance ratings, his BMW payments, all of it depended on the $4.2 million in orders from the company his family didn't know I owned. I'd kept the secret deliberately. Geographic distance helped. I'd moved to Seattle after college while they stayed in Portland. I incorporated under a holding company name. Stayed out of the press, let my CMO handle public appearances. But mostly, the secret held because they never cared enough to ask real questions about my life. Still playing with lab equipment? Was about as deep as their curiosity ran. While they saw failure, I was building an empire. While they planned Michael's future, I was securing my own. While they calculated how much of a burden I was becoming the very thing they claimed I'd never be, successful beyond their ability to comprehend. The transplant paperwork changed everything. During the pre-authorization process, the hospital's financial counselor mentioned that my father had been receiving dependent benefits for my medical care. "I'm sorry," I said, certain there'd been a mistake. "I pay my own medical bills." That's when we discovered Richard had been using my social security number to claim me as a disabled adult dependent on his insurance, collecting $3,200 monthly for 14 months. He'd forged my signature on the documents. The medical credit card he'd opened in my name had $23,000 in charges, all for Patricia's cosmetic procedures. But the real masterpiece was the tax fraud. For 2 years, Richard had been claiming my medical expenses as deductions while I paid out of pocket, pocketing $18,900 in fraudulent refunds. Total theft, $86,700, all while telling me I'd never accomplished anything worth their investment. Now, sitting in this conference room, watching Richard's face go pale as Dr. Morrison mentions inconsistencies in the insurance documentation, I realize something profound. The people who spent my entire life convincing me I was powerless had just handed me the perfect weapon to destroy them, and they have no idea what's coming. The call to Victoria Chen came at 11:47 p.m. that same night. I sat in my Tesla in the hospital parking garage, rain drumming against the windshield like impatient fingers. The fluorescent lights cast everything in sickly yellow, but my mind had never been clearer. Isabella! Victoria's voice carried that sharp alertness of a lawyer who never really sleeps. What's wrong? I need you to listen very carefully, I said, watching a security guard make his rounds between the concrete pillars. Remember that family situation I mentioned? It just became a federal case. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds, Victoria calculating, processing, already shifting into attorney mode. How federal are we talking? Wire fraud across state lines, tax fraud, identity theft, approximately 87,000 in damages. I kept my voice level, clinical, and I have documentation for all of it. Jesus, Isabella, are you somewhere safe? Safe. The word almost made me laugh. I'd been unsafe my entire life, just not in the way Victoria meant. I'm fine. But I need to know exactly how much power I have here. And I need to know tonight. What Victoria didn't know, what nobody knew except my accountant and the IRS, was that I'd been preparing for something like this for years. Not this specifically, but some version of it. When you grow up in a family that treats you like a liability, you learn to protect yourself in ways that go far beyond emotional boundaries. The trust had been established 3 years ago when Meridian first hit $20 million in valuation. The Isabella R. Hartwell Irrevocable Trust, structured by Victoria herself, held controlling interest in IR Holdings LLC, which owned Meridian Biotech Solutions. The beauty of the structure wasn't just asset protection, it was information control. Even if someone tried to investigate my finances, they'd hit layers of legal entities that would take months to unravel. But the real secret weapon wasn't the corporate structure, it was the evidence I'd been collecting without even realizing it. Every dismissive comment, every cruel joke, every instance of favoritism, I'd documented it all in what started as therapy journals and evolved into something much more powerful: dates, witnesses, financial records. When Michael got his house down payment, I'd requested the same loan in writing, keeping Richard's rejection letter. When they spent $85,000 on Michael's wedding, I'd saved Patricia's text, suggesting my backyard barbecue. When they refused to get tested as kidney donors, I'd recorded Richard's exact words: "Why waste a good organ on a lost cause?" The paper trail painted a picture of systematic financial and emotional abuse spanning 14 years. But now, with the insurance fraud, I had something that would make federal prosecutors salivate: a clear pattern of criminal behavior targeting a vulnerable family member. Victoria and I met the next morning at her downtown Seattle office. The view from the 42nd floor stretched across Elliott Bay, but I kept my focus on the documents spread across her mahogany conference table. She'd worked through the night, and it showed in the precise stacks of legal papers and the 3 empty coffee cups lined up like soldiers. "This is worse than you described," she said, sliding a manila folder toward me. "The insurance fraud alone carries a maximum of 20 years federal. But combined with the tax evasion and the pattern of abuse." She paused, studying my face. "Isabella, this could destroy them completely." I opened the folder and found Victoria's preliminary analysis. Federal wire fraud charges. State identity theft charges. IRS criminal investigation referral. Asset forfeiture procedures. The legal machinery was already in motion. She'd filed the initial complaints before dawn. "How long?" I asked. "FBI Financial Crimes Unit will want to interview you within 48 hours. They'll need your medical records, bank statements, copies of all the forged documents." Victoria leaned back in her leather chair. "But there's something else. Something that makes this particularly interesting to federal prosecutors." She pulled out another file, this one thicker. "Your family doesn't just depend on you financially through their investment portfolio and Michael's commissions. Richard's been claiming you as a dependent for tax purposes for 3 years, not just the insurance fraud period. He's been reducing his taxable income by approximately $12,000 annually by claiming he supports you." The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. While publicly calling me a failure, Richard had been privately claiming credit for supporting me to reduce his tax burden. Meanwhile, I'd been paying corporate taxes on millions in revenue, probably contributing more to federal coffers in a single quarter than Richard had in his entire career. There's more, Victoria continued. The medical credit card he opened in your name? Patricia used it for cosmetic surgery, but she also charged medical equipment. A CPAP machine, prescription glasses, dental work. She's been using your credit for her healthcare while you were paying out of pocket for dialysis. I thought about those 4-hour sessions, watching my blood cycle through machines while Patricia got her face lifted with credit cards bearing my name. The clarity I'd felt in the hospital conference room crystallized into something harder, more focused. What do you need from me? I asked. Victoria smiled, not the polite professional smile she gave clients, but something sharper. Nothing. You've already given me everything. The question is what you want to do with it. That afternoon, I drove to Portland for the first time in 6 months. The family house looked smaller than I remembered, the beige siding more faded, the lawn more neglected. Richard's Buick sat in the driveway next to Patricia's white SUV, the same vehicles they'd been driving for years, carefully maintained but never upgraded. Financial comfort, not wealth. The kind of stability they'd denied me while building it partly on my stolen identity. I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat in my car across the street, watching Patricia water her flower beds through the front window. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd built her entire identity around maintaining appearances. The same woman who'd suggested a backyard barbecue for my wedding was now tending roses that probably cost more than my monthly dialysis copays. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Mom says you were weird at the hospital yesterday. Everything okay? I stared at the message for a long moment. Weird. That's what they called it when I finally stopped accepting their abuse quietly, when I hinted that I didn't need their help, when I showed the first sign of having power they didn't know about. I typed back, everything's fine, just processing some information. What kind of information? The kind that changes everything. He didn't respond. Probably went back to scrolling through his phone, dismissing my words the same way they'd dismissed everything else about me for 32 years. Michael had never learned to take me seriously because he'd never had to. In his world, I was the family failure, the cautionary tale. The sister who'd never amounted to anything despite all their patience and support. If only he knew that his mortgage payments depended on my company's orders. That his performance bonuses came from contracts I personally approved. That his entire career existed at my discretion, and I'd been protecting him without his knowledge for 18 months. The federal agents called that evening while I was back in Seattle, reviewing quarterly reports in my corner office. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, her voice crisp and professional. Miss Hartwell, we've reviewed your complaint and the supporting documentation. We'd like to schedule an interview for tomorrow morning, if possible. Of course. I should mention this case has some unusual elements that make it particularly interesting to our unit. The scope of the fraud, the vulnerability of the victim, and the sophistication of the scheme suggest this isn't opportunistic crime. This appears to be systematic financial abuse. Systematic financial abuse, the clinical term for what I'd lived with my entire adult life. What I'd normalized, rationalized, accepted as the price of being part of a family that had never wanted me in the first place. Agent Walsh, I said, looking out at the Seattle skyline through my office windows. There's something else you should know. The people who did this, they have no idea I can fight back. They think I'm powerless. Are you concerned about retaliation? No, I said, and realized I meant it completely. I'm concerned about their reaction when they find out how wrong they've been about everything. The interview took place the next morning in a federal building downtown, all glass and steel and the kind of institutional authority that makes people speak in whispers. Agent Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the focused intensity of someone who'd built a career on unraveling financial crimes. She spread the evidence across a metal table like she was laying out a hand of cards. Bank records, forged signatures, insurance documents, tax returns, the paper trail of my family's crimes, documented in black and white. Walk me through the discovery, she said, her pen poised over a legal pad. I told her about the hospital, the financial counselor's confusion, the gradual revelation of how extensively Richard had been using my identity. Agent Walsh took notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just listening with the patience of someone who'd heard similar stories before. The pattern suggests escalation, she said when I finished. starting with claiming you as a dependent for tax purposes, then moving to insurance fraud, then identity theft for medical expenses. In our experience, this kind of financial abuse typically continues until the victim discovers it or the perpetrator gets caught. What happens now? We execute search warrants, interview the subjects, build the case for prosecution. She closed her notebook and looked at me directly. Miss Hartwell, I want you to understand something. Based on the evidence you've provided, we're looking at multiple federal felonies. The people who did this to you are facing serious prison time. Prison time. The words should have made me feel something: satisfaction, vindication, maybe even regret. Instead, I felt only that same crystalline clarity I'd experienced in the hospital conference room. There's one more thing, I said. They don't know about my company. They think I'm barely surviving financially. When this comes out, when they realize what I've actually accomplished. I paused, thinking about Richard's shocked face when he learned the truth. It's going to destroy their entire worldview, Agent Walsh smiled slightly. In our experience, financial predators often underestimate their victims. It's part of what makes them think they can get away with it. That evening, I was back in my Seattle office when my assistant knocked on the door. Miss Hartwell? There's a call from Portland. Someone named Patricia Hartwell says she's your mother? I hadn't spoken to Patricia directly in months. Our communication had been limited to brief texts and messages passed through Michael. But something in my assistant's tone suggested this wasn't a social call. Put her through. Patricia's voice carried that familiar edge of barely controlled irritation. Isabella. We need to talk. There's been some kind of mistake with the insurance paperwork, and your father is very upset. A mistake. Even now, even when caught red-handed in federal crimes, they were calling it a mistake. What kind of mistake, Mom? Some bureaucrat at the hospital is claiming there are problems with the dependent coverage. Your father spent hours on the phone today trying to straighten it out. Her voice rose slightly. This is exactly the kind of drama we don't need right now. Drama. The word they'd used my entire life to dismiss my legitimate concerns, my health problems, my requests for basic fairness. Now they were using it to describe their own criminal behavior being exposed. The call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting me from the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. Richard's voice cut through the phone like a rusty blade, sharp with the kind of rage I'd learned to recognize in childhood, the tone that meant someone was about to pay for his problems. You think you're clever, don't you? No greeting, no pretense of family pleasantries. Whatever game you're playing with these insurance people, it ends now. I sat up in my Seattle bedroom, rain pattering against the windows, and felt that familiar clarity settle over me like armor. Good morning to you too, Dad. Don't get smart with me. I know you're behind this harassment. Some federal agents showed up at the house yesterday asking questions about paperwork. Paperwork, Isabella. As if taking care of your medical expenses is somehow criminal. The audacity was breathtaking. Even caught red-handed, he was rewriting the narrative, casting himself as the victim, and me as the ungrateful daughter causing problems. It was so perfectly Richard that I almost laughed. Taking care of my medical expenses, I repeated slowly. Is that what you call it? We've carried you financially your whole life. Those insurance benefits and tax breaks barely cover what you've cost us in worry and disappointment. His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper I remembered from childhood arguments. But this stops now. You're going to call whoever you called and tell them this was all a misunderstanding. I walked to my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and started the coffee maker. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle was waking up early. Commuters, joggers. The normal rhythm of a city full of people who didn't spend their mornings being threatened by family members who'd committed federal crimes. And if I don't? The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then, you think you can threaten us? We're your family. Without us, you're nothing. We'll make sure everyone knows what an ungrateful, vindictive daughter you really are. There it was. The threat line Victoria had predicted he'd use, delivered with the same self-righteous fury he'd wielded my entire life. The man who'd stolen nearly $90,000 using my identity was threatening to destroy my reputation for reporting his crimes. Everyone, I said, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, the one I'd bought myself after landing my first major contract. That's interesting. Who exactly is everyone, Dad? Another pause. Shorter this time. Your mother's book club. The neighbors. People at church. Michael's colleagues. We have standing in this community, Isabella. People respect us. When we tell them what you've done. What I've done. I took a sip of coffee, savoring both the warmth and the irony. Please, be specific about what I've done. You know exactly what you've done. Turning family business over to federal agents like some kind of criminal informant. Embarrassing us in front of the hospital staff. Making your mother cry with worry. His voice was building to that familiar crescendo of righteous indignation. We raised you, we fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. And this is how you repay us? I thought about my 18-year-old self, working 3 jobs to pay for the college education they'd refused to fund, while simultaneously paying for Michael's private university. I thought about sleeping in my Honda Civic while they handed him a $150,000 house down payment. I thought about 4-hour dialysis sessions while Patricia charged cosmetic surgery to credit cards opened in my name. You're right, I said quietly. You did raise me. You taught me exactly who you are. Don't you dare. I have to go, Dad. I have a business to run. I hung up before he could respond, but the phone started ringing again immediately. I turned it off and finished my coffee in peaceful silence. The escalation began in earnest that afternoon. Patricia called my office directly, somehow getting past my assistant to reach my personal line. Her voice carried that trembling quality she used when she wanted people to think she was fragile, the same tone she'd perfected during Michael's childhood tantrums to make me feel guilty for existing. Isabella, honey, please. We need to talk about this terrible misunderstanding. The endearment sounded foreign in her mouth. She hadn't called me honey since I was small enough to still believe she might love me. Your father is beside himself. The stress is affecting his blood pressure. I'm sorry to hear that, Mom. Are you? Because it doesn't seem like you care what this is doing to our family. The trembling intensified. These agents, they're treating us like criminals. They took your father's computer, Isabella. His computer, like he's some kind of identity thief. The word hung in the air between us. Identity thief. Which was exactly what he was, though Patricia seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would call it by its proper name. They asked me about medical procedures. She continued, her voice breaking slightly. About credit cards and insurance forms. I don't understand any of this financial nonsense. I just signed what your father told me to sign. Just following orders. The defense of enablers throughout history. Patricia had spent 32 years actively participating in my emotional and financial abuse, but now she wanted me to believe she was an innocent bystander who'd stumbled into federal crimes by accident. Mom, I said gently. Did you think the money was coming from somewhere? What money? We were trying to help with your medical expenses. That's what families do. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I wondered if she'd actually convinced herself it was true. Patricia had always been gifted at rewriting history to cast herself as the victim or the hero, never the villain. By opening credit cards in my name? I don't know anything about credit cards. That's your father's department. Her voice shifted, becoming sharper. But I know you're trying to destroy this family over some paperwork confusion. Is that really what you want? To see your parents in prison over a misunderstanding? Prison. The word she'd been avoiding finally surfaced, carrying all the weight of consequences she was just beginning to understand. I want you to stop stealing from me, I said simply. Stealing? The word came out as a shriek. How dare you accuse us of stealing, after everything we've sacrificed for you, everything we've given up? What exactly have you sacrificed, Mom? Silence. Long enough that I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow with the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes their script isn't working anymore. Your father gave up a promotion to stay local when you were sick as a child, she said finally. I turned down opportunities to travel because you needed so much attention. We've spent thousands on your medical bills over the years. Which medical bills? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't have to justify our parenting to you, Isabella. We did our best with a difficult child. The trembling was gone now, replaced by that cold anger I knew much better. But if you think you can destroy us over some bureaucratic nonsense, you're wrong. We have friends. We have standing in the community. People know what kind of daughter you are. What kind of daughter? The phrase that had followed me my entire life, whispered behind closed doors, implied in every family gathering, used to explain why I deserved less love, less support, less basic human decency than Michael. What kind of daughter am I, Mom? The ungrateful kind, the vindictive kind, the kind who turns on her own family the moment things get difficult. Her voice was pure venom now, all pretense of maternal concern abandoned. Michael is devastated. He can't believe his own sister would do something so cruel. Michael. Of course they'd brought him into this, probably spinning some version of events where I was the aggressor, and they were innocent victims of my inexplicable malice. Is Michael there? He's been here every day since this started. Unlike some people, he actually cares about his family. Put him on. Isabella, I don't think. Put him on the phone, Mom. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. I could hear muffled voices in the background, Patricia's urgent whispers, then footsteps approaching the phone. Izzy? Michael's voice carried that bewildered hurt he'd perfected as a child whenever his actions had consequences. What the hell is going on? Hello, Michael. Mom and Dad are freaking out. There were FBI agents at the house. FBI, Izzy. They're saying Dad committed some kind of fraud, but that's insane. He's the most honest person I know. The most honest person he knew. The man who'd been systematically stealing from me for years, who'd forged my signature on legal documents, who'd filed fraudulent tax returns. But Michael had never learned to see Richard clearly, because he'd never been on the receiving end of his cruelty. What did they tell you about the fraud? Something about insurance and taxes, paperwork stuff I don't understand. His voice rose slightly. But I know Dad would never steal from anyone, especially not family. There has to be some explanation. There is an explanation. Then why aren't you helping them fix this? Why are you letting federal agents terrorize our parents over some bureaucratic mix-up? Our parents. Even now, even at 32 years old, I felt the familiar sting of exclusion. They were our parents when Michael needed me to fix something, but they were my parents when I needed support. Michael, I said carefully, how much do you know about my medical expenses? What do you mean? Do you know how much dialysis costs? How much I've spent on medical bills over the past 2 years? No. I know it's expensive. That's why Mom and Dad have been helping, right? Helping. The word they'd all agreed to use, the sanitized version of systematic theft that let them sleep at night. They haven't been helping me, Michael. They've been helping themselves. To my identity, my credit, my tax deductions. I kept my voice level, factual. Dad has been claiming me as a dependent while I pay my own bills. Mom used credit cards opened in my name to pay for her cosmetic surgery. They've stolen nearly $90,000. That's impossible. It's documented. Bank records, forged signatures, fraudulent tax returns, all of it. You're lying. His voice cracked slightly. You're making this up because you're angry about something else. This is just like when we were kids and you'd blame me for things when you were mad at Mom and Dad. When we were kids. When I'd been punished for his mistakes, overlooked for his achievements, held to standards he'd never been expected to meet. When I'd learned that speaking up about unfairness only made the unfairness worse. I'm not making anything up, Michael. Then why didn't you come to us first? Why didn't you try to work this out as a family before involving federal agents? The hurt in his voice was genuine, which somehow made it worse. We could have fixed this quietly if there really was some kind of mistake. Some kind of mistake. Even Michael, faced with evidence of systematic fraud, was reaching for explanations that didn't require him to see his parents clearly. Because it wasn't a mistake, I said, and because I'm tired of protecting people who've never protected me. Protecting people? Izzy, what are you talking about? I almost told him then. Almost explained that his job, his commissions, his BMW payments, all depended on contracts with my company. That I'd been protecting his career for 18 months while he dismissed me as a failure. That his parents' investment portfolio was gaining value from my success, while they called me worthless. Instead, I said, you'll understand soon enough. Understand what? Everything. I hung up before he could respond. But I could picture his face, that same confused frustration he'd worn as a child when the world didn't arrange itself around his comfort. Michael had never learned to handle situations he couldn't charm or dismiss his way out of, because he'd never had to. The next morning brought a call from Victoria. "They've retained counsel," she said without preamble. "James Morrison from Morrison and Associates, criminal defense, white-collar crimes. Good lawyer? Expensive lawyer," which suggests they're taking this more seriously than their phone calls to you would indicate. I could hear papers rustling in the background. "There's something else." Agent Walsh called. "They want to execute the search warrants tomorrow, and they'd like you present." "Present for what?" "The confrontation. They want to see how the family reacts when they realize the scope of what you've discovered." Victoria's voice carried a note of anticipation. "Isabella, this is going to be brutal. Are you prepared for that?" Was I prepared to watch the people who'd raised me realize their crimes had consequences? To see the moment they understood I wasn't the powerless victim they'd spent 32 years creating? "I've been preparing for this my entire life," I said. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Michael's birthday dinner, scheduled for Saturday evening at the family house in Portland. Patricia had texted me 3 days earlier with the invitation, a transparent attempt at normalcy, as if family dinner could somehow undo federal crimes. I'd accepted immediately, knowing it would be the perfect venue for the truth. Agent Walsh and her team would be positioned outside, waiting for my signal. The search warrants were already signed, the evidence already catalogued, the charges already filed. All that remained was the confrontation itself, the moment when my family would finally understand exactly who they'd been stealing from. I drove to Portland that Saturday afternoon in my Tesla, the October rain turning the highways slick and reflective. The drive gave me time to think, to prepare for what was about to happen. In a few hours, the people who'd spent my entire life convincing me I was worthless would learn I was worth more than they could comprehend. The family that had profited from my success while calling me a failure would watch their own world collapse in real time. The house looked exactly the same as always: beige siding, carefully maintained lawn, Richard's Buick in the driveway next to Patricia's white SUV. Normal, suburban. The kind of place where federal crimes seemed impossible, where systematic abuse could hide behind dinner parties and book clubs and the careful maintenance. The federal courthouse in Portland looked different 6 months later. Less imposing, somehow. More like just another building where people went to work, filed paperwork, and sorted out the messy details of consequences. I sat in the back row during Richard's sentencing hearing, watching the man who'd raised me stand before Judge Catherine Morrison in an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look gray and papery. 18 months federal custody, the judge announced, her voice carrying the weight of finality. Minimum 15.3 months to be served, followed by 2 years supervised probation and full restitution. Richard's shoulders sagged. Patricia, sitting 3 rows ahead of me, made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She'd aged a decade in 6 months, her carefully maintained blonde hair now showing gray roots, her designer clothes replaced with discount store basics. The country club membership was gone, along with the house, the SUV, and most of their retirement savings. Michael wasn't there. He'd stopped speaking to all of us after Med Supply Corp fired him, and I terminated their contract. Last I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, he was living with his girlfriend's parents and working at a car dealership in Beaverton. His BMW had been repossessed 3 months earlier. The financial ruin had been swift and comprehensive. Richard owed $127,000 in restitution, penalties, and legal fees. The IRS audit had uncovered an additional $34,000 in questionable deductions going back 5 years. They'd been forced to refinance the house, then sell it when Richard's consulting work dried up after the conviction became public. Patricia's credit was destroyed. They'd moved from their $4,800 a month house to a $1,650 a month apartment, in a complex that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams. The social consequences had been equally devastating. Patricia's book club had quietly asked her to step down. The neighbors stopped making eye contact. Michael's former colleagues at MedSupply whispered about ethics violations and family dysfunction. The local newspaper had covered the story with the kind of breathless fascination small communities reserved for fallen pillars of society. But perhaps the cruelest irony was the silence. In the 6 months since the arrests, they'd tried calling me exactly 47 times. I knew because I'd kept count of the blocked numbers, the voicemails I deleted without listening to, the letters I returned unopened. They'd even tried reaching me through my company, but my assistant had strict instructions. The last attempt had been a handwritten letter from Patricia, delivered to my Seattle office just 2 weeks ago. I'd recognized the careful cursive on the envelope, the same handwriting that had addressed birthday cards with $20 bills inside, while Michael got checks for hundreds. I'd handed it directly to building security for disposal. They wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo the consequences of 32 years of systematic cruelty. But some doors, once closed, don't reopen. Some trust, once shattered, can't be rebuilt with sorry and promises to do better. I left the courthouse without speaking to anyone and drove north toward Seattle. The October landscape blurred past my windows, the same route I'd traveled countless times for family obligations that had never felt like anything but endurance tests. This time, I knew I'd never make the drive again. My new life had taken shape with surprising ease. The kidney transplant had come through the donor registry just 3 weeks after the arrests, a perfect match from a 28-year-old teacher in Vancouver who died in a motorcycle accident. Dr. James Morrison, my biological father, had performed the surgery himself. We'd had coffee twice since then, careful conversations that felt like the beginning of something real rather than the obligation of shared genetics. Meridian Biotech had expanded beyond my most optimistic projections. We'd opened a fourth facility in Portland, the irony wasn't lost on me, and our latest funding round had valued the company at $73.2 million. The headcount had grown to 189 employees, and we'd filed for 12 additional patents. Forbes had featured us in their Companies to Watch section, though I'd insisted the article focus on our technology rather than my personal story. The penthouse apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced west toward Elliott Bay. I'd bought it 6 months ago, paying cash, choosing it specifically for the view and the silence. No neighbors above me, no family obligations below me, no voices telling me I'd never amount to anything worth their investment. Victoria had become more than my attorney. She was the closest thing I had to family now, along with Dr. Morrison, and a small circle of friends who'd known me only as the successful CEO, never as the family disappointment. We met for dinner once a week, usually at a small Italian place near her office, where the owner knew our names and our usual orders. Any regrets? She'd asked me last Tuesday, over wine and pasta that cost more than my family's weekly grocery budget when I was growing up. I'd considered the question seriously. Richard was in federal prison, learning what powerlessness actually felt like. Patricia was working part-time at a department store, her social standing destroyed, her comfortable retirement replaced with government assistance. Michael was starting over at 30, his career in ruins, his easy confidence shattered by consequences he'd never learned to navigate. No, I'd said, and meant it completely. The revenge hadn't been the point, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't appreciate the symmetry. The point had been freedom from their voices in my head, their expectations dragging me down, their constant reminder that I was somehow fundamentally less deserving of love and success than Michael. Now, driving through the Seattle evening with NPR playing softly and my phone mercifully silent, I felt something I'd never experienced in 32 years of family dinners and holiday obligations. Peace. The city lights stretched out below my apartment windows as I settled into my home office with a cup of tea and the quarterly reports that needed review. Meridian's latest contract was with a hospital system in Portland, the same system where I'd received my transplant, where Dr. Morrison still performed surgeries, where the conference room fluorescent lights had buzzed overhead during the meeting that changed everything. The circle was complete. But not in the way Richard and Patricia had imagined when they'd spent my childhood telling me I'd never escape their influence. They'd been right that family shapes us, but wrong about which family would matter in the end. I think about that a lot now, How we choose our real families from the people who see us clearly and love us anyway, rather than the people who share our genetics and use them as weapons. How success isn't measured by the approval of people who were never going to approve of anything, but by the peace that comes from building a life that doesn't require anyone else's permission. The truth is, I didn't destroy my family. I simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. I stopped enabling their cruelty by absorbing it silently. I stopped pretending that blood relations automatically deserved loyalty, respect, or forgiveness. Some of you reading this know exactly what I'm talking about. You've sat through family dinners where every word felt like a small knife. You've been told you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too ungrateful for pointing out patterns of abuse that everyone else pretends not to see. You've been convinced that you're the problem, that your expectations are unreasonable, that you should be grateful for crumbs of affection from people who treat strangers with more kindness than they've ever shown you. Here's what I want you to understand. You don't owe anyone your destruction. Not your parents, not your siblings, not anyone who uses the word family as a shield for behavior they'd never tolerate from strangers. Love isn't supposed to hurt. Support isn't supposed to come with conditions that change based on someone else's mood. Family isn't supposed to be something you survive. The people who truly love you will celebrate your success, not resent it. They'll support your dreams, not sabotage them. They'll protect you when you're vulnerable, not exploit your weakness for their own gain. And if you're reading this in a hospital room, or a studio apartment you can barely afford, or any place where you're fighting battles that the people who raised you refuse to acknowledge, know that your worth isn't determined by their recognition. Your success doesn't require their approval. Your peace doesn't depend on their participation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop participating in your own diminishment. Stop accepting treatment you wouldn't tolerate from strangers. Stop making excuses for people who've never made excuses for hurting you. The freedom that comes from that choice is worth everything it costs. I learned that lesson at 32, sitting in a hospital conference room while the people who'd raised me debated whether I deserved to live. But you don't have to wait that long. You don't have to wait for federal crimes or medical crises or dramatic confrontations. You can choose your real family today. You can start building a life that doesn't require anyone else's permission. You can stop protecting people who've never protected you. The door is always open. You just have to be brave enough to walk through it. And on the other side, there's peace. There's success on your own terms. There's the quiet satisfaction of a life built by your own hands, measured by your own values, celebrated by people who actually know who you are. There's freedom. What's your story? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this resonated with you, please share it. Someone in your network might need to hear this today. Follow for more stories about building the life you actually want, not the one other people think you should have.